All right, perfect. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate being here today. Today, I would like to talk about OSINT for competitive intelligence. I see a lot of people presenting at these conferences about either looking at individuals, ISIS fighters or missing people and so on, or at companies for the purpose of going after them for, let's say, a network penetration test, for example, or maybe a social engineering campaign. And I actually use OSINT in a very, very different way at work, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit. It's for competitive intelligence, and we'll get into this in a second. But I wanted to quickly pitch you on why you should also attend this presentation if competitive intelligence is not your field, because you might use some of the same techniques for other areas. So competitive intelligence will help you understand your competition for strategy, marketing, and sales. So if you're in that space, then absolutely this is bang on for you. But I've also used the same techniques to vet future employers before I signed an offer letter, because you want to make sure that you're joining a good growing company. Then you might also want to screen vendors before signing contracts, understand how the company is doing and whether they're growing, whether they're successful, and whether there are any red flags. And you want to conduct due diligence before investing in a company. Now, that might not be, could be in the stock market, could be if you're an investor in a small company, but it could also be when you're joining a company that is offering you stock options. Then you're becoming an investor in that company, and you want to know if you're investing your time in a good way. So quick background on me. Some folks might remember me from last year. I gave the pickpocketing talk and did the pickpocketing competition. Glad we're not doing this year, because that would be hella hard with a virtual conference. My background is in product marketing for InfoSec. I've been doing that for over 2 decades. Spent a lot of hours on competitive intelligence there, but that's not the main part of the job. It's part of the job, but it's not the main part of the job. I've also participated in the DEF CON Social Engineering CTF and won the black badge there like 2 or 3 years ago now. And my life goal is acquiring all of the skills from like the spy and heist and con artistry movies. So yeah, I guess the pickpocketing kind of fits into that. So what is competitive intelligence? Basically, it's figuring out how your competitors are doing, how they're doing certain things, what strategies they have, all of those kind of things, what customers they have. So competitive intelligence is usually made up of these things. You've got OSINT, then you've got HUMINT, which is human intelligence, interviewing people who are customers of your competitors, former employees, current employees, maybe, if you can get them drunk at a conference, for example. And then you take all of that knowledge, you analyze it, and you curate it. And then you need to disseminate it to the people that want to use it. So internally, that would be your sales team for battle cards. It would be your product strategy team, the marketing team, senior executives, and so on, right? In this talk, we're only going to talk about OSINT, because otherwise we wouldn't get done in 25 minutes. And also, I think the OSINT part is really the interesting one for company or for this conference. So I always start on LinkedIn, and that's really no different when you're starting to kind of map out a company from an attack perspective. The things I look at first is how big is the company. I want to get a feel for like, who am I dealing with? Is this like a giant or a small company? Are they old or new and so on? And there are 2 types of employee numbers. There's this one here, which is the one that is self-reported by the company. And that's usually a range. And then you've got this number up here on the right, and that shows you how many people on LinkedIn are actually registered for that company. So the difference is quite big here, right? 130 to 500 to 1,000. This is for a company called Theranos. They were struggling for a while. I think we just, wasn't Elizabeth Holmes in the previous talk? I think she was the Theranos CEO. Joined a little bit late because I was in the green room, apologies. But that's the company we're looking at here, right? So that's really a stark difference in the numbers of employees. And for example, in one competitive situation I was in, our competitor acquired a company and they really drummed it up in the press release. And I took a look at that one number here on the top right, and I saw that the only people in that company were the CEO and one intern. And that really puts it into perspective for your sales team and your strategy. And also when you're trying to position that acquisition, that competitive acquisition over the phone with your salespeople. The second thing I look at, and now we're getting into territory where you have to have a paid LinkedIn account, the headcount trending. I love that even more than just the headcount count itself. And this is Theranos again. We're seeing that there were, close to 300 employees a while back, and then in July 2019 they were down to 123. And so something happened, like in June, July 2018, when they lost a lot of people. So this is really good to see the overall trend. Are they growing? Are they stagnating? Or are they actually going down? So one example from a competitor is I looked at one competitor. Their headcount was stagnant. So they were just flat across the board. They were operating in a booming industry, and they hadn't gotten any funding. So what do I read out of that? So that means that they probably are just breaking even with that headcount. They're not growing, despite the growing market. They're probably not able to invest a ton into their technology and so on. So it tells you a lot when you see that trending. Then size and growth of departments. So here, this is also on LinkedIn on the Insights page, which is a menu off of the company page that you're looking at. And here, I just looked at random companies, by the way. These are not my competitors because I wouldn't be able to talk about them directly. So this is a company called LogRocket, smaller company, and you see that they really amped up sales by 140% in 6 months and like over 1,000% in the past year. So that probably means they had next to no sales in the past. They had invested mostly in engineering, gotten the product ready, and now they're ready to go to market. They're hiring salespeople because they think now they actually have a product that they can sell. So this tells you like when a company's ready to go out there, for example, or where they're investing and cutting back, which departments they're cutting back. Also on the LinkedIn Insights, you find new hires. So this is particularly interesting for two reasons. You can look at what's the hiring trend in terms of volume. This doesn't mean that it's net new hires. So let's say the headcount growth was flat, but you're seeing a lot of new hires. That means they have a lot of turnover, right? Because they're not growing the net number. You're also seeing at the very bottom who they hired in senior positions. You don't see all the positions, but you see the senior positions especially. So if we look here at the bottom left, we see that they hired a CTO for Azure Global. So that means that this company is probably investing in going to the cloud if they haven't already, right? So this is or I think this might have actually been Microsoft. So this shows you that where they're investing and where they're placing their chips. You also see notable alumni. So here, for example, this is somebody who doesn't have a current position. They were previously a chief information security officer at Microsoft. Now, the reason I blacked out the name is because I don't know the background, and you have to be careful with speculation. But if somebody was a CISO, leaves the company, and has no current position, it could be that there was a security issue, for example. So if people leave and don't have a new position, that could show trouble with certain areas of the company. It could also be that that person is just taking a sabbatical. You don't know, right? Or it's maybe joining a stealth startup. So that's why I wanted to especially here, black out the name, because I think you need more context. It's an indicator, but it's not. It doesn't tell you the full story. All right, now that I've taken a good look at LinkedIn, I look at a website called Crunchbase. So if you've heard of TechCrunch, they're kind of like a news site for startups mostly. And Crunchbase is a site that tracks all of the funding that startups are getting. Most of my competitors are in the startup world. So they have venture capital funding. Some of them are public companies, but most of them have venture capital funding. And so here we're seeing how many rounds they got, when their last funding round was. And so then if you correlate that with their headcount growth, let's say they haven't gotten any funding for a while and their headcount is still growing fast, that probably means that they're operating a profitable business and that they can sustain that growth themselves. If they're a small company and they're growing super fast, but they just got a ton of cash, it's probably inorganic growth, right? So there's those kind of things. And you can also look at, I work in the software industry. Most of the cost in the software industry is people cost. So if you know the headcount and you know roughly like where they have their development centers, so what the going rate is for a developer, for example, you can figure out pretty much what their burn rate is. And with their burn rate, you can figure out like when is their funding going to run out and so on. And so you can kind of do a back of the envelope calculation of their internal financial situation. Then Glassdoor. I know that social engineers love Glassdoor because it gives you insight into the morale and kind of like the jargon inside the company. It's a great source. And it's also a great source for competitive intelligence. So here, not really like a commercial company, but I was poking around a little bit for examples. And this is an example from the NRA, the National Rifle Organization. And so here I found a comment from one of the employees that said, hey, we need to quit sending duplicate membership renewals. So that shows that there is probably like some struggle with process and so on. And if I were to have a competing offering against the NRA, and I don't know, like, wouldn't be like another, well, I guess if I was organizing another like gun association or something, I might say, hey, you know, like with the NRA, like, you know, they don't have their stuff together, you know, like, have you also gotten the duplicate renewals and those kind of things? So you can take what you learn here, feed that to your salespeople, use that in your messaging and so on. So I've seen in the past, for example, companies where they've said, hey, our technical support is awful, right? So use that in your sales pitches, right? And another thing we found was, or I found was, here, watch out for the general operations branch in particular, you know, like with like horrible managers. So that also shows you where is a company struggling, where are they likely not executing well, and you can use that to place your bets on how you want to attack them. Another thing I look at are job ads. So job ads can tell you where a company is investing, especially if they're not just hiring, backfilling an existing role, but they're either hiring a lot more of something. Let's say there was a famous case with Microsoft where people knew that they were coming out with a new version of Windows and were going to announce that soon because they were hiring like crazy for their customer support, for the technical support call center, right? This here is an example from Uber where they're hiring an actuarial analyst. So this is not a surge in the amount of who they're hiring, but what they're hiring. For those that are not familiar with it, actuaries are basically insurance mathematicians. So this shows me that Uber is looking probably for a skill set to provide their own insurance for drivers, because especially in the beginning, and I think this is about maybe a year old, this post, or longer, where I saw this and I thought, oh, this is interesting. They were having trouble with you know, objections of like, oh, you know, passengers are not insured. So now they're investing in that part, figuring out the insurance side of things. Then we're looking at Siftery and Built With. So if I want to figure out the tech stack that is behind a company, yes, I can do a port scan, I can look at Showdown and those kind of things. But there are also some other sites out there that are self-reported. Some of them are self-reported. So Siftery tells you which technologies a company is using, and I think that is self-reported. And then Built With is basically a scan of their website and their public-facing web real estate, and it looks at what kind of technologies are embedded in their website. So you can get a view on that. So if I was looking at PayPal or at Etsy, I'd figure out what their tech stack is. And that can also be interesting for you if you're either trying to attack a company as a social engineer, or if you're trying to go after a company from a technology perspective, and you want to use the tech stack in that way. I also like to track websites and see what companies are changing. So here we're seeing a before and after change for the price on a certain good on a website. I've also seen alerts where I've seen A/B split tests where companies are testing out new messaging. I've seen website changes, small subtle changes on the pricing page where they're adding or removing a feature in a certain pricing tier, right? So those things can be really helpful in understanding what direction your competitor is moving. The best website I found for that, that's just a standalone website tracking, is Visual Ping. And that is free for a handful of websites or a handful of pages. And if you want to go beyond that and track more pages, then it's a paid-for service. Eventually, when you're doing competitive analysis, your marketing and sales people are going to say, well, we want to know like who the customers are. We want to run a replacement or displacement campaign, right? So where do you get customer lists? You can get them from a few different places. So you can, of course, try to buy lists from marketing vendors. These can be of varying qualities, but here are usually places where I look. So reference customers and case studies on their website, discussion forums where people are talking about using a certain technology, job postings. If a company is posting and saying, hey, we're looking for somebody to who knows how to use Splunk, then you know that company has Splunk. So if you're trying to displace Splunk, that's an indicator that they have it. Then resumes and LinkedIn. You can see on people's LinkedIns and resumes what kind of technologies they've used at which company, because they'll probably tell you what they were responsible for. And then also peer review sites. So there's a lot of those. I have a list on a later slide for a different reason. So where companies or individuals review certain tools that they've used, and the information on there typically doesn't list the company, but it often lists the full name or the first name and a picture. You can do a reverse image search. You can search for the full name, and you have the company in no time. Now those are all pretty manual, so may not be the best thing if you're looking at a large list. So there are some other ways that you can do that. There are so-called technographics vendors. So, and these I split into two different groups. One is technographics of technology that's deployed behind the firewall, so not observable through a scan. And those vendors basically look at some of the things that I have listed on the left, and they scrape the web and then accumulate that into databases. So you don't have to do that work yourself. You can buy that as a service. HG Insights is the market leader there. Demand Matrix is a smaller company that also does. And then you can also get information, and this is easier to get, and there is more companies offering that, is technographics on any technologies a company is using on the public web. So let's say you're looking for anybody who's using, I don't know, Google Analytics is an example that everybody will know. Because it's a tracking code that you put on your website, and that tracking code is observable by somebody who's scanning your website. So that's what I mean by publicly accessible. And there is many others, like people using Marketo, certain e-commerce stores, stuff like that. So Oracle DataFox and Built With have this kind of information, but there is a ton of others. Then I look at spending. Who are their more information on their customers. If they are selling to the public, to the public sector, then you can go to usaspending.gov and so on. There's some other websites too, and you'll see who the receiving federal agency was that received the funds, and then also on the left here, the recipient name is the reseller that they bought it through. So I looked for Splunk, and so basically, this reseller sold to this department. So now I have if I'm trying to replace Splunk, I have a list of companies or agencies that are using that. Websites using Demandware. So now I'm flipping the build width on its head. I'm no longer asking, what is my technology, my competitor using as a tech stack? I'm asking, who is using my competitor? So if I'm competing with Demandware, for example, now I have a customer list here because that may be publicly observable. One interesting thing is some companies have a model where they are creating a separate instance or a subdomain per company, per customer that they're selling. So one example that probably a lot of you are familiar with is Okta. When you're logging into your company's Okta site, you're typing in companyname.okta.com, right? There's other companies that have the same kind of a model. So if you have that, you can actually do subdomain brute forcing, especially if you have a list of potential targets. So if you have a list of Fortune 500 companies or a list of all of your prospect companies in your database, you can now do a DNS lookup for that subdomain and see if that exists or if it doesn't resolve to an IP. Seek legal advice before you do that, because that's an active scan and depends on your on your jurisdiction and also how you're doing it. So, for example, rate limit your searches on your requests so that you don't bring down that server. Pricing. Your salespeople will ask you about pricing all the time, so you can do some Google dorking for that, using a file type search for certain PDFs, spreadsheets, sometimes Word documents can be helpful. But also, if they're selling to the public sector, then pricing can also be observable in published government price lists. Not always, but often. So if you search for competitor and then GSA price list, GSA is one of the public schedules that agencies can buy through, then you often get a government price list. That's not the same as the official list price. Assume that the government is getting usually between 5 and 20% of a discount off the list price, but that gives you an indication of the price structure, the volume discounting, and those kind of things. And then finally, peer review sites. Peer review sites are really, really helpful to figure out not only who your competitors' customers are, but also how they're doing, right? Like what's identified as a weakness and as a strength. And the 4 sites I recommend there are IT Central Station, Gartner Peer Insights, G2 Crowd, and Trust Radius. All of those are really good if you're selling B2B software. And then analyst reports, of course. So download things like the Magic Quadrant, the Forrester Waves, write-ups from other analysts, and you can also do analyst inquiries. So most of these need a subscription. Often the Magic Quadrants and Waves are available behind registration, just by giving your name from some of your competitors, especially if they score well in those reports, so you can get those for free. But if you want to do an inquiry, for example, with an analyst, you usually have to have a subscription, and your PRAR department can tell you if you have a subscription for a particular analyst and which one. Okay, that's it. That's all the prepared part of this presentation. So do we have any questions on the Discord Track 2 channel?